Legislation. General Audience number 36 of August 20th, 1980. When Christ says in the Sermon on the Mount, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery,' from Matthew 5, verse 27, he refers to something everybody in his audience knew perfectly well and felt himself bound to in virtue of God Yahweh's commandment. Nevertheless, the history of the Old Testament shows that the life of the people, united to God Yahweh by a special covenant, as well as the lives of individuals, often moved away from this commandment. The same point is shown by a summary glance at the legislation richly documented in the books of the Old Testament. The prescriptions of the Old Testament laws were very severe. They were also very specific and entered into the smallest concrete details of life. See, for example, Deuteronomy chapter 21 verses 10 through 13, Numbers chapter 30 verses 7 through 16, Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 1 through 4, chapter 22 verses 13 to 21, and Leviticus chapter 20 verses 10 through 21, etc. One can presume that as the legislation of effective polygamy became evident in the law, there was an increased need for fixing its juridical extent and securing its legal limits. Hence the great number of prescriptions, and also the severity of the punishments laid down by the lawgiver for breaking such norms. On the basis of the above analyses of Christ's appeal to the beginning, in his discourse on the dissolubility of marriage and the certificate of divorce, it is evident that he clearly sees the fundamental contradiction contained in the marriage law of the Old Testament inasmuch as it accepted effective polygamy. That is, the institution of concubines in addition to legitimate wives, or the right of cohabitation with a slave woman. One can say that this law, while combating sin, at the same time contained in itself the social structures of sin. In fact, it protected and legalized them. In these circumstances, the essential ethical meaning of the commandment, "Do not commit adultery," necessarily suffered a fundamental revaluation. In the Sermon on the Mount, Christ reveals this meaning again, and thus passes beyond its traditional and legal restrictions. It is perhaps useful to add that in the interpretation of the Old Testament, while the prohibition of adultery is marked, one might say, by a compromise with the concupiscence of the body, the opposition to sexual deviations is clearly defined. The relevant prescriptions, which impose capital punishment for homosexuality and bestiality, confirm this opposition. As for the behavior of Onan, son of Judah, whose name is the origin of the modern term onanism, sacred scripture says that, quote, "what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also." Genesis chapter 38, verse 10. Taken in its entirety, the marriage law of the Old Testament places the procreative end of marriage in the foreground. In some cases, it tries to implement the equality of women and men before the law. For example, it explicitly says about the punishment for adultery, quote, "if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death." Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. But on the whole, it judges the woman differently and treats her with greater severity. One should perhaps draw attention to the language of this legislation, which is, as always in such cases, an objectifying language of the sexology of that time period. It is also an important language for the whole of the reflections on the theology of the body. We find in it the explicit confirmation of the character of shame that surrounds what in man belongs to sex. The sexual is even considered in some sense impure, especially in the case of physiological manifestations of human sexuality. Uncovering nakedness, see for example Leviticus chapter 20 verse 11 and verses 17 through 21. Is stigmatized as the equivalent of performing a complete illicit sexual act. The very phrase seems expressive enough. There is no doubt that the lawgiver sought to use the terminology corresponding to the consciousness and practices of society at the time. In this way, the language of Old Testament legislation should convince us not only that the physiology and the bodily manifestations of sex are known to the lawgiver, but also that they are evaluated in a definitive way. It is difficult to avoid the impression that this evaluation has a negative character. This certainly does not cancel the truths we know from Genesis, nor can one accuse the Old Testament, and among others, also the legislative books, of being a sort of precursor to Manichaeism. The judgment about the body and sex expressed in it is not primarily negative or even severe, but rather marked by an objectivism motivated by the intention of setting this area of human life in order. It is not concerned directly with the order of the heart, but with the order of social life as a whole, at the basis of which stands, as always, marriage and the family. When one considers the sexual problematic as a whole, one should perhaps briefly turn one's attention to another aspect, namely the link between morality, the law, and medicine, as shown in the relevant books of the Old Testament. They contain many practical prescriptions in the area of hygiene or medicine, characterized more by experience than science, according to the level reached at that time. See, for example, Leviticus chapter 12, verses 1 through 6, chapter 15, verses 1 through 28, and Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 12 through 13. In our time, by the way, the link between experience and science is evidently still relevant. In this wide area of problems, medicine always closely accompanies ethics, and ethics, like theology, seeks its collaboration. The prophets. When in the Sermon on the Mount Christ says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery," and immediately adds, "But I say to you," it is clear that he wants to rebuild in the consciousness of his audience the ethical meaning that belongs to this commandment, distancing himself from the teachers, the official experts of the law. But in addition to the interpretation that comes from tradition, the Old Testament offers us another tradition for understanding the commandment, "You shall not commit adultery." It is the tradition of the prophets. When they referred to adultery, they wanted to remind Israel and Judah that their greatest sin was abandoning the one true God in favor of the cult of various idols that had been adopted easily and thoughtlessly by the chosen people in contact with other peoples. In this way, what is characteristic of the language of the prophets is the analogy with adultery, rather than adultery itself. Yet, such an analogy also helps one to understand the commandment, "You shall not commit adultery," and its interpretation, which, as noted, is absent in the legal texts. In the revelations of the prophets, particularly in Isaiah, Hosea, and Ezekiel, the God of the covenant, Yahweh, is often represented as bridegroom, and the love with which he joined himself to Israel can and should be equated with the spousal love of a couple. Because of its idolatry and desertion of God, the bridegroom, Israel commits a betrayal before him that can be compared to that of a woman in relation to her husband. It commits, in fact, adultery. With eloquent words, and often in extraordinarily drastic images and comparisons, the prophets present the love of Yahweh, the bridegroom, as well as the betrayal of Israel, the bride, who throws herself away in adultery. This is a topic that we must take up again in our reflections when we analyze the problem of the sacrament. See TOB Audience number 104. But already now we should touch upon it as far as necessary for understanding Christ's words in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28, and for appreciating the renewal of ethos implied in these words, "But I say to you." While Isaiah emphasizes in his texts above all the love of Yahweh the bridegroom, who in all circumstances goes to meet the bride, overlooking all her infidelities, Hosea and Ezekiel abound in comparisons that show above all the ugliness and moral evil of the adultery committed by the bride, Israel. In the next meditation, we will try to enter still more deeply into the texts of the prophets, to clarify further the content corresponding to the commandment, "You shall not commit adultery," in the consciousness of those who listened to the Sermon on the Mount.